So obviously this is not necessarily a myth, but it depends on what you've heard about Kierkegaard. One thing that people often hear is that Kierkegaard is a postmodernist existentialist subjectivist who thinks truth is relative to you, the individual, to me, the individual. You have your truth, I have my truth, and if I believe God exists for me. If you don't believe God exists, God does not exist for you. And I think most of this is completely wrong. That's not what Kierkegaard is saying. Let's look at two particular cases, and then I'll make a comment on how to interpret Kierkegaard. Let's talk about one of those other things people hear Kierkegaard says that I probably should have mentioned already. Faith and reason have nothing to do with one another, or worse, they have something to do with each other. They're opposed. One's relevant to the other. Reason is contrary to faith, and you should ditch reason and go with faith. Well, Kierkegaard doesn't really say faith is absurd. What he says is that reason is perspectival. Reason doesn't operate in a perspective vacuum. We do not have access to a perspective-less perspective, if there could be such a thing. We don't have a perspectiveless reason, and if you look at faith from one particular kind of perspective, faith will appear to be absurd. That perspective is that of European Enlightenment philosophy, and especially of Hegelian philosophy. If you look at Christianity from that perspective, faith, Christian faith at least, is absurd. And that's all Kierkegaard's point is here, that reason has a perspective. But what you do with this is a separate question. You could just totally ditch the Hegelian perspective, and then you're free to have faith. And it might not appear absurd at all from whatever perspective you adopt in its place. And I think Kierkegaard is actually very close to the likes of St. Augustine and Anselm, where faith is considered to be quite rational. But that depends on what perspective you adopt in place of Hegelianism. Kierkegaard's main point is that the Hegelian perspective is not compatible with genuine Christianity. And one way of articulating that is explaining that Christian faith must be absurd from the perspective of Hegelianism. But no one ever said you had to be a Hegelian, except maybe the Hegelians, but they were wrong. Now, if you want to understand this more, I strongly recommend a book called Faith Beyond Reason by C. Stephen Evans. C. Stephen Evans, Faith Beyond Reason, published by Erdman's. There's a nice explanation of Kierkegaard on perspectival reason. Now let's look at something else. Maybe his most famous quote, truth is subjectivity. Well, I don't think he's saying here that truth is subjective. Truth depends on the subject. What is true about religion depends on my belief. And accordingly, what is true about religion, also depending on your belief, may be incompatible with what is true for me. He's not saying that. He's saying truth is something that has to be subjectively applied. Truth must be lived. Let's say the truth about religion, the truth about God is objective. What follows from that? Well, the Enlightenment perspective, and the Hegelian perspective is truth is objective and universal, and we all access it the same way, and we all access the same truth, and the individual doesn't really matter. What matters is the universal truth accessed by universal humanity. And Kierkegaard says, no! No! The objective truth about Christianity, by its very nature, is something that the individual must incorporate in his life on an individual basis. The individual must live that truth. The objective truth about Christianity is something that must be subjectively applied. Real truth will be found in the life of a person living by it. Now, if that truth is objective, great, but it will be lived subjectively. And only in that sense, I think, is true subjectivity. Now, the most important thing to do when studying Kierkegaard is probably this. Be attentive to the pseudonyms. Let's look at Dostoevsky as an example. The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. Ivan says some things. Ivan has his perspective. Dostoevsky gives him some words. Father Zosima says some things. Zosima has his perspective. Dostoevsky gives him some words. Are Zosima's words Dostoevsky's words? Are Ivan's words Dostoevsky's words? Yes, in a sense. He gave them to those characters. But does Dostoevsky agree with Ivan's perspective? Does he agree with Zosima's perspective? The first thing you have to say is that he's not putting these words in these characters because he agrees with all the words. He's putting them there because this is a conversation, this is a clash of perspectives that is worth understanding. And the next thing you can say is he agrees with Zosima more than he agrees with Ivan, probably. Now with Kierkegaard, it's something very similar. Kierkegaard's most controversial, most interesting, most popular, most fashionable sayings are pretty much all from his pseudonyms. He invents pseudonyms. He takes what for Dostoevsky is a few pages of commentary by Ivan or Zosima and makes it an entire book in the conversation, the clash of perspectives, and his pseudonyms are the ones who say these things, at least the most important, or the most interesting and popular things. Well, that doesn't mean he agrees with them. In fact, he probably does not in many cases. What he does is he has a Hegelian or some other version of modern man look at Christianity and explain in his own way that the two just don't mix. So Johannes de Silentio, coming from a more or less Hegelian perspective, maybe Kantian, but I think probably Hegelian a little more than Kantian, in the book Fear and Trembling. Johannes de Silentio, John the Silent One, author of Fear and Trembling, but a fictional character invented by Kierkegaard, exposes the tension between Hegelianism and Christianity. He explains, from the Hegelian perspective, the faith of Abraham has no place, except a very bad place, a condemned place. His faith is absurd and he's guilty of murder. That's the Hegelian perspective. Well, what is Johannes de Silentio doing about that? Well, he's John the Silent One. He's not doing anything. He's telling you this is the situation. What you do with that is your decision. Understand the situation. Kierkegaard's goal, he says, is to reintroduce Christianity to Christendom. See, he's dealing with 1800s Denmark. Everyone thinks everyone's a Christian around here in 1800s Denmark. But everyone also thinks, if they've studied at university, that Hegel's great. And they just don't mix. De Silentio's point, and Kierkegaard's biggest point, is that they don't mix. But should you be a Hegelian or a Christian? Well, Kierkegaard's advice is pretty clear. If you want his advice, it's the same as Dostoevsky's. Go with Zosima, go with Christianity. Now, his pseudonyms often have strange names. John the Silent One, John the Climber, Johannes Climacus, Vigilius Halfniensis, the Watchman of Harbour Town, or the Watchman of Copenhagen. One of the pseudonyms means hilarious bookbinder. He has these great pseudonyms for his characters, but they're having this big conversation, and Kierkegaard is showing us that this is a conversation worth paying attention to, but he's not endorsing everything said by everyone in that conversation. What does he himself say? Well, look to books written without a pseudonym, in his own name. One superb example is Works of Love. Look to Works of Love, and you will find a much more traditional Christianity. A lot more like Augustine, a lot more like Luther, a lot more like Nicene Christianity, Reformation Christianity, a lot more like my grandfather's Christianity. Now, I don't want to overstate this and say that he never disagrees with Augustine or Luther. I won't say there's no original theological thought. There might be some. You'll probably find some of those sorts of things if you study Kierkegaard long enough. There might be things no one else noticed before. There might be a few disagreements with Luther here and there and so on. But by and large, if you're attentive to the pseudonyms, you might find there's a whole lot more of Orthodox Christianity and a whole lot less of the postmodern existentialist, relativist, subjectivist Kierkegaard of legend in the actual views of actual Kierkegaard. All those other things, even if we could say that we'd understood them properly, which is frequently not the case, usually come from the pseudonyms who do not bear his name. And they also do not bear a name that suggests that they agree with him much. Incidentally, one of my favorite pseudonyms, one of my favorite Kierkegaard books, One of my favorite books, I might even say, the book on Adler, the pseudonym Petros Minor. Now, in this particular book, Kierkegaard's pseudonym Petros Minor adopts a much more Christian perspective. He's defending the concept, reintroducing Christendom to the concept of apostolic authority, the authority, the God-given authority of an apostle, someone who can write the New Testament. And what is the name used by this pseudonym? Petros Minor, Peter the Lesser, as in someone who's associated with Peter the apostle, but is less than him. He's the kind of guy who knows he's not an apostle, but will follow them. That, I think, is much more representative of Kierkegaard's own position. And it's an interesting case where his pseudonym has a very Christian perspective.